Hello everyone, Professor Krislik here. So we made a video laying out some of the foundations of what is political participation with a focus on what does political participation look like in a democracy. So I wanted to now make a video thinking about what does political participation look in non-democracies. So we know that political participation exists across all government regimes, all government types, but it does look different. So we know that participation exists, but it is not equivalent to what it looks like in a democracy within an authoritarian regime. So there are some key distinctions here just at the outset. In democracies, participation equals influence. When it comes to voting, to choose who's in power, to protest, to joining political parties as a way to shape public policy, as a way to shape government outcomes. In authoritarian regimes, there is political participation, but it is oftentimes controlled, oftentimes faces constraints, institutional constraints, and constraints from leadership. So there is a central claim here that participation and representation are interconnected tools of governance. So then we can ask, why allow participation at all if it can challenge the regime? So let's start by thinking about voting. We can think about voting. In a democracy, we know it is a hallmark of a democratic system, a entry point into the political process. Some citizens stop there. They might vote every 2 to 4 years, and they don't do much else. While others are engaged in voting all the time, engaged in party politics, engaged in protests. So let's think about voting in authoritarian regimes. So we know that elections do exist. In almost every country on earth, some sort of elections exists. So in authoritarian regimes, elections exist, but are heavily controlled. Many authoritarian regimes hold elections, but either control the outcomes, maybe even just simply cheat and fake the vote outcomes. So when we think of some examples, we can think of Russia, presidential elections, but there is limited competition. To get on the ballot, it is difficult. You practically need the approval of authorities. And then, which happened with Alexei Navalny, authorities find ways to exclude certain candidates from even getting on the ballot. In Iran, elections exist, but with candidates vetted by religious authorities. In China, we see that there are local elections, but they are tightly controlled by the Communist Party. So these elections exist, they occur, but they look very different. They're not free and fair like we think of as a hallmark of a democracy. So the initial question that we asked, well, if authoritarians are controlling the state, controlling society, why use elections at all? Well, something that's occurred and came up throughout the semester is this idea of legitimacy. In Russia, a high turnout and large margins are used to signify support for the Putin regime. It makes it look like the Putin regime has internal and, not so much today, but previously, external legitimacy. In Iran, elections are framed as participation in Islamic governance. And in China, they're used local elections are used to project responsiveness to local communities. Also, something else that we've seen, it can be used for information gathering. It can identify regions of dissatisfaction. It can be used as a way to see where there are opposition pockets of discontent around the country. So in Russia, where you have some free and fair elections at local levels, it can help show where you have pockets of dissatisfaction. It can also be as a way to show that you have some feedback mechanism to help the authorities know, okay, this is where we have grievances. So they can also be for a bit of a control. We can view it as a control mechanism. Encourage participation through social pressure. So in Russia, we see this a lot with Russian workplaces, state networks, as a way to still have elections. So you still get that feedback mechanism. But when you want to control the outcomes, you can see that in Russia, workplaces that are tightly associated with the state subsidized, even a state-owned enterprise itself, those employees, of course, are going to vote the way that they are pressured to vote. So when we think about, okay, what voting actually means, participation does not simply equate to and does not simply equal support. It oftentimes reflects compliance, strategic behavior, and of course, risk avoidance. So this then raises the question of why vote if outcomes are predetermined. So when we think about why people would vote in this, that's maybe a little harder to understand. If you know the outcome is predetermined, why still vote? This is something that, as political scientists, as scholars, as students of comparative politics, we have to think about. Okay, so if voting is one form of political participation that we see in democracies, let's think of protests. Protests, again, in a democracy, a hallmark of a democracy. The right to express grievances against the government. The right to show your displeasure against the government. Well, protests in authoritarian regimes do come at much greater risks. There's risks of arrests, risk of violence, risk of surveillance. Maybe even if the state doesn't come in and arrest, you can still be surveyed and then you're put on lists. And in an authoritarian context, maybe you don't want to be on those lists because that can lead to job loss or issues down the road. So in Russia, we see that thousands are detained in protests supporting opposition figures. When Alexei Navalny was still alive and he would protest, we would see demonstrators arrested at his movements quite regularly. We could do a whole video just on how the Russian state policed that, why some were arrested and others, but for our just 30,000 foot level, we know that thousands of protesters are arrested if the protests are against the regime, a challenge to the regime. In Iran, which has been in the news recently, not simply for the war, but also because of brutal crackdowns on protesters, on demonstrators, arrests, and the use of coercion. We see a lot of varying data, but up to maybe like 30,000 demonstrators, protesters have been killed recently in Iran in anti-government protests. Like huge numbers of demonstrators being repressed. In China, we see the use of surveillance, the use of censorship, which limits protest organization and people's willingness to engage in protest. So we asked that question. We know that this is occurring. We know that protests are dangerous. We know that the state might repress, might use surveillance. So then why do people still protest? Well, we know that they still protest over grievances, economic hardships, corruption, inequality. And in Iran, we saw protests over deteriorating economic conditions. In China, we've seen localized protests over labor or land disputes. In Russia, we've seen anti-corruption protests, especially the Navalny movement, where he really highlighted corruption within the Russian government. So when we think about why protests emerge, maybe when they do, or why they emerge in general, we see that protests are more likely when the state is weaker, when there are divisions within elites, and when coordination becomes possible. So if the state is weak, maybe their ability to repress is not as strong. Maybe their ability to use surveillance technology is not as strong. When there are when there are divisions among elites, we can see that maybe some elites will side with the demonstrators and then can put force and pressure on the government to either change policy or maybe even to collapse. And coordination becomes possible. In 2011, during the Arab Spring, some protests in Russia, we saw that coordination becomes easier. People were using social media to say, we're going to protest at this time, at this place. So in the Arab Spring and in different autocracies, coordination becomes possible through social media. We know that autocrats have since found ways to counter this, but coordination is an important piece of the puzzle. So in democracies, protests can be big, hundreds of thousands of people. That doesn't not really viewed as a threat to the regime, but as a way to show displeasure towards the regime. When we think of protests in authoritarian regimes, we typically are viewing smaller scale protests, oftentimes short-lived. Maybe the protests aren't as long, they don't turn into social movements, they don't turn into prolonged movements, and they are more quickly suppressed. So in Russia, nationwide protests occur at times, but are rapidly contained. The majority of protests in Russia and in other authoritarian regimes are very localized. So they're not oftentimes national. And we saw after the parliamentary oddities in Russia, we saw some large-scale nationwide protests, but for the most part, they're localized, they're small, they're either dispersed quickly or they are just short-term. So that's a key characteristic. Smaller, oftentimes fragmented. So when we think of protests that do occur, especially in an authoritarian regime like Russia, they are oftentimes dispersed or repressed if they're viewed as direct challenges to authority. So in Russia, the example I oftentimes give is trash collection or in trash dump protests, which we've seen over the past decade across Russia, especially in the West, where those protests were just allowed to occur. Whereas anti-regime, anti-Putin protests are viewed as direct challenge to authority, and so oftentimes repressed because they are viewed as threatening forms of political participation. Harder to control, harder to keep in line than maybe voting, so more likely to trigger repression. And we see this across authoritarian regimes. So when we think of civic participation in an autocracy, it still exists. There's still elections. We still see pictures of protests. But then we have to think about and question, do those forms of participation really make a difference? Does voting really make a difference? In class, I used the example of North Korea, where we saw elections at the end of February, where the results were 99.3 in favor of the ruling party in Kim. So when we think of elections through that mechanism, it looks quite different than in a democracy. And protests are another way we can look at this. There's the No Kings protests that you've recently saw in the news. We see large-scale protests. We may see some anti-war protests in the United States, some anti-war protests across Europe. But the government isn't going to come out and repress those movements. In an authoritarian regime, that political participation looks quite differently. If it's localized and maybe not a challenge to authorities may let the protests go, like we see in Russia. North Korea probably wouldn't even allow that level of protest. But when there's a challenge to the regime, when there's a challenge to those in power, those protests are absolutely crushed. And so when we think about political participation in an authoritarian regime versus a democracy, we know it looks quite different. Thank you.